The ranch would be his if he could survive one night. One night with the 3 giant women who'd already put 27 men in the ground. 27 graves dotted the hill behind the ranch house, each one a silent testament to a man who thought he could claim what wasn't his. They were greedy men, violent men, stupid men. But Samuel Harper wasn't any of those things. He was something far more dangerous. He was a son. And he carried a secret, a folded piece of parchment in his coat that felt heavier than any stone. It was a secret that could either be his shield or the very thing that made these women tear him apart, piece by bloody piece. He knew the stories. Everyone in the valley did. They said the sisters were witches, cannibals, creatures born of shadow and bad soil. They said they were unnaturally tall, unnaturally strong, and that they hated all men with a fury that could curdle milk. The front gate didn't just creak. It screamed like something dying as he pushed it open. The wind whipped across the dead grass, dry and sharp, like it was trying to peel the skin from his face. This place wasn't just abandoned. It felt rejected. The wood of the main house was splintered and gray, baked by a sun that gave heat but no life. The windows were dark, hollow eyes in a skull, and the silence. The silence was so loud it felt like a threat. And there they were. Perched on the porch, not moving, not breathing, just 3 towering silhouettes against the dying sun. They were shadows stitched into the world. He felt their eyes on him, each gaze a different kind of weight. The one on the left, dressed in stark black, seemed to look straight through his flesh, sizing up the rot in his soul. The one in the middle, a shock of wild red hair, stared with an unnerving stillness, as if memorizing the exact way his bones would snap. But the third one, the tallest, with a pale, jagged scar that cut a cruel smile across her throat. She watched him differently. There was something in her eyes that wasn't just hate. It was a flicker of something else, something he couldn't name. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe, just maybe, it was hope. Samuel refused to let them see him tremble. He squared his shoulders, the dust puffing from his coat, and walked forward. Each step was a decision. His boots thudded against the warped porch steps, a drumbeat counting down his final moments. "Name's Samuel Harper," he said, his voice steady, betraying none of the chaos in his chest. "I came for what's mine." He didn't get a chance to knock. The massive oak door swung inward on its own, a silent, dark invitation into the belly of the beast. The air that rushed out smelled of lavender, old dust, and something metallic and sweet, something like old blood. He stepped over the threshold, and the door whispered shut behind him, sealing him in. The lock didn't click. It didn't need to. "You're late," a voice said. It was warm, like honey, but with a discordant note that made the hairs on his arms stand up. It was the redhead. He turned. They were no longer on the porch. They were inside with him, standing in the parlor, blocking every door, every window, every possible path to escape. They moved like smoke. "I wasn't told there was a deadline," he said, keeping his voice even. His fingers, however, twitched, wanting to touch the folded will hidden in his coat. It felt like a useless prayer now. "There's always a deadline when the land bleeds," said the tallest sister, the one with the scar. Her voice was a rasp, a dry rustle of leaves. He gave a humorless smile. "Let me guess. You're going to test me, just like the others." The sister in black took a step forward. She was shorter than the other 2, but somehow more intimidating. Her eyes were chips of obsidian. "The others came for land," she said, her voice cold as a tombstone. "You came for blood." His heart stopped. It was a single, perfect hammer blow to his composure. She knew. Or she was making a terrifyingly accurate guess. He had to play his card. Slowly, deliberately, he reached into his coat and pulled out the yellowed parchment. His father's signature, scrawled in still dark ink, seemed to mock him from the page. "It's mine by law," he said, placing it on a dusty table between them. "One night. That's what the will says. I survive until sunrise, and the ranch is mine. That's the game, isn't it?" The redhead laughed, a low, chilling sound. She moved closer, and he had to crane his neck to look up at her. She was a giant, a creature of myth, and her eyes were the color of a stormy sky. "No," she said, her voice losing all its warmth. "The game's over. This is a judgment." Samuel held his ground. "Judgment for what?" The sister in black answered. "For your father, and for what he did to our mother." The words hung in the air, heavy and poisonous. He stiffened, the blood draining from his face. I didn't know anything about that." "You didn't ask," whispered the scarred sister. "But you felt it, didn't you? The wrongness. You carry it in your bones. It's why you're here." He looked from one stony face to the next. They were right. He had always known something was broken in his family's history, a dark space he was taught never to look into. "The will says one night," he repeated, his voice weaker now. "If I make it to dawn—" "If you make it to dawn," the redhead interrupted, leaning down until her face was inches from his, "you'll inherit every single sin that comes with this dirt. And trust me, boy, you're not strong enough to carry them." He met her gaze, his own fear solidifying into something hard and sharp. "I already carry them," he said, and the conviction in his own voice surprised him. That gave them pause. The three women exchanged a look, a silent conversation passing between them in a heartbeat. The sister in black was the first to move. She lit a kerosene lamp, the sudden flare of light casting their shadows into monstrous shapes on the walls. She nodded down a long, dark hallway. "Your room is at the end of the hall. Dinner is in 1 hour. There are no locks on the doors. You will bring no weapons, and if you hear screaming in the night," she added, her eyes glinting, "do not come out of your room. It won't be you they're screaming for." Samuel walked past them, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. The air was thick with their presence, the scent of lavender, rust, and something wild, like damp earth and ozone before a storm. His assigned room was small and stark. The sheets on the bed were pulled so tight they looked like a layer of old snow. On the wall hung a single faded photograph. 3 young girls, giants even then, standing beside a woman whose face had been violently scratched out, leaving a spiderweb of white scars on the paper. He took the photo off the wall and placed it face down on the nightstand. He didn't want those absent eyes watching him. The hour crawled by, each tick of the grandfather clock in the hall sounding like a footstep on a grave. The sun finally bled out below the horizon, and the house sank into a deeper, more profound darkness. A single clear bell rang once from downstairs. Dinner. He walked down the hallway, the floorboards groaning under his weight, each sound an alarm. He felt like a man walking to his own execution. The dining room was dominated by a massive table carved from a single piece of dark, gnarled oak. The wood was etched with symbols he didn't recognize, symbols that seemed to squirm in the lamplight. A full meal was laid out. Roasted meat, steaming vegetables, a loaf of dark bread. It looked impossibly normal. 3 chairs were set on one side of the table, and a single lonely chair on the other. His chair. He sat. They remained standing, watching him from across the table, their expressions unreadable. Then the sister in black spoke. "Before you eat, you will answer one question." He nodded, his throat tight. "What?" she asked, her voice devoid of all emotion. "Do you fear most?" He thought of the 27 graves. He thought of his father's cold eyes. He thought of the scratched-out face in the photograph. He took a slow breath and gave the only honest answer he had. "Living a life that means nothing." For the first time, something flickered across their faces. It might have been surprise. They sat down, their movements synchronized and silent. He picked up his fork and began to eat. The food was real, it was delicious, and the wine they poured was heavy and sweet. But the silence in the room was a living thing. It pressed in on him, suffocating him. He had to break it. "So tell me," he said, setting down his glass, "why the test? Why all the dead men?" "They weren't tested," the redhead said, not looking at him. "They failed. They came here with rot in their hearts, and the land simply rejected them." "Some came to kill us," the sister in black added. "They thought 3 women living alone were an easy prize." "Some came to conquer us," the scarred one rasped. "They saw our height, our strength, and wanted to break it, to own it." "They all came to take something," the redhead concluded. She finally looked at him, her eyes pinning him to his chair. "So, we ask you again, Samuel. Why are you here?" He swallowed a mouthful of bread that now tasted like ash. He could lie. He could try to trick them. But looking into their ancient, weary eyes, he knew it would be pointless. "I'm here because my father left me nothing," he said, the truth raw and ugly. "Nothing but this cursed land and a legacy of whispers. I'm here to take back the one thing he couldn't completely destroy." The redhead glanced at her sisters. "He's not lying." "Not yet," the one in black corrected. Just then, a flash of lightning illuminated the room, followed by a distant, angry crack of thunder. The lamps on the table flickered wildly, and the shadows danced like devils. And then came the sound. A loud, desperate knock. It wasn't coming from the front door. It was coming from beneath their feet, from under the floor. Instantly, all 3 women were on their feet, their chairs scraping back against the wood. The air, which had been tense, was now electric with a new kind of dread. This was something even they feared. "Go to your room," the scarred sister commanded, her voice urgent. "Now." But Samuel stood too. He wasn't a boy to be sent to his room, not anymore. "What's down there?" he demanded. "History," the sister in black said, her face a pale mask in the gloom. "And the reason you won't live to see the morning." He didn't budge. He had come for answers, and he wouldn't be scared off by noises in the dark. "I'm not leaving this room until I know everything." They stared at him, a silent, furious trinity. He expected them to force him, to drag him away. But instead, the scarred sister walked to the massive stone fireplace. She reached into the shadows and pressed a specific brick. There was a grinding sound of stone on stone, and a section of the hearth slid away, revealing a dark, gaping hole in the floor. A trapdoor. "Then follow us," she whispered, her voice laced with something that sounded almost like pity. "And pray that what lives down there doesn't recognize the smell of your blood." The air that rose from the opening was cold and foul, thick with the smell of damp earth, mildew, and despair. It was not a cellar beneath the house. It was a prison. The narrow stone steps led down into a darkness that felt absolute. The scarred sister held the lamp high, and the light revealed walls slick with moisture, iron rings bolted into the stone, and chains hanging from them like dead vines. Rusted tools of a terrible purpose lay scattered on the floor. In the corner, a large leather-bound ledger was nailed to a wooden crate, its cover sealed shut with a thick glob of black wax. Samuel stepped onto the cold stone floor and felt a low, resonant hum travel up through the soles of his boots. The very stones seemed to cry out in agony. "What is this place?" he breathed, his voice a choked whisper. "The reason we don't leave," the redhead said from behind him. "The reason men like you keep coming. The reason they keep dying." His eyes scanned the horrific chamber, and then he saw it. Scratched into the far wall, carved deep into the wood and the stone beneath it, was a single line, repeated over and over again, a frantic, desperate prayer. She asked for mercy. He gave her fire. The blood in his veins turned to ice. He knew that line. The words slammed into him, knocking the air from his lungs. It was a fragment of a nightmare, a memory from the deepest, most shadowed corner of his childhood. It was the last thing he ever heard his mother say before she vanished, before his father told him she had died in a fire that consumed her schoolhouse. He spun around, his face a mask of dawning horror. The three sisters had turned as one, their faces grim, their eyes filled with a terrible, knowing sadness. "You didn't come for the land, did you?" the sister in black said softly. "You came to find her," the redhead finished. Samuel could only nod, his throat locked tight with a grief he had carried for 20 years. And from the deepest shadows of the cell, beyond the reach of the lamplight, a voice emerged. It was a dry, cracking whisper, the sound of vocal cords long unused, but it pierced the veil of his memory and struck him right in the heart. "Samuel?" He dropped to his knees. The sound of his own name, spoken in that broken, familiar voice, shattered the carefully constructed walls he had built around his past. He crawled forward, his hands scraping on the rough stone, the lamplight throwing his desperate shadow against the wall. "Mama," he whispered, the word a prayer, a question, a sob. A figure shuffled out from the darkness. She was impossibly frail, a skeleton draped in rags, her skin pale and thin over sharp bones. Her wrists were raw and scarred from years in rusted shackles. Her hair, which he remembered as a cascade of rich auburn, was now a thin, stringy mat of gray. But her eyes, when she lifted her head to the light, he saw her eyes. They were his eyes, and they were full of tears. "Samuel," she whispered again, her voice gaining a sliver of strength. "I knew you would come. I always knew." He reached out a trembling hand, his fingers brushing against hers. Her skin was as cold and dry as old paper. "They told me you were dead," he choked out. "Dad, he said you died in the fire." "He lied," she rasped, her voice breaking. "He always lied. This is where he brought me. This is where he kept me. And this is where they found me." He looked back over his shoulder. The three sisters stood by the stairs, silent sentinels of sorrow. They hadn't moved, they hadn't spoken. But the air around them was thick with a storm of emotion, guilt, grief, and a rage that had been simmering for 2 long decades. "You knew," Samuel said to them, his voice cracking with accusation and disbelief. "You knew she was here." "We found her 5 years ago," the scarred sister said, her voice gentle. "She was barely alive. We nursed her, cleaned her wounds. But she wouldn't speak. Not a single word. Not until tonight, when she heard your voice." "Why didn't you tell me?" he yelled, the sound echoing in the small, terrible room. "Why let me believe she was gone?" The redhead stepped forward, her massive frame filling the stairway. "Because we didn't know you, Samuel. We didn't know whose side you were on. You are his son. You carry his blood." "But not his cruelty," Samuel shot back, his eyes burning. "Not his lies." His mother's hand tightened on his, a fragile anchor in the swirling chaos. "I told them," she whispered, looking at the sisters. "I told them you were different. I told them you had my heart, not his. It's the only reason they spared you." He turned back to her, his mind reeling. "Spared me from what?" Her gaze drifted past him, toward the 27 makeshift graves on the hill outside. "From what they did to the others." And in that moment, everything clicked into place. The legend, the fear, the dead men. They weren't just trespassers or greedy fools. They were his father's men. Men sent over the years to keep the secret buried, to silence the 3 women who knew the truth. Men who came to ensure his mother was never found. The sisters weren't murderers. They were guardians. They weren't protecting the land. They were protecting her. Samuel staggered to his feet, his legs weak. He looked at his mother, a ghost returned from the grave. He looked at the three women, her unlikely saviors. "What happens now?" he asked, the question hanging in the cold, dead air. The sister in black stepped down into the cellar, her expression hardening. "Now," she said, her voice ringing with the finality of a judge's gavel, "we bury the past. For good." They ascended from the tomb, leaving the darkness behind. As they stepped back into the house, the storm finally broke. Rain hammered against the roof like angry fists, and thunder rattled the window panes. But inside the house, a strange calm had settled. Samuel didn't flinch at the storm's fury, neither did his mother. She sat in a chair by the hearth, wrapped in a thick wool blanket, while the sisters moved with quiet purpose, preparing a fragrant tea that smelled of strange herbs, burnt sugar, and rich earth. "She was our teacher," the redhead said, her voice soft as she poured the steaming liquid into a cup. Samuel looked at her, confused. "Your mother, when we were just girls, ostracized for our size, for being different. She was the only one in town who wasn't afraid of us. She built a small school and taught us how to read, how to identify herbs, how to use our voices when the world wanted us to be silent." "You knew her before?" Samuel asked, his mind struggling to piece together this new history. "She was the only kindness we ever knew," the scarred sister added, stirring the tea with a wooden spoon. "Your father, he was a powerful man, but he was small inside. He wanted her. He saw her as another property to be owned. When she refused him, his pride couldn't bear it. So he burned down her school, spread the rumor that she died in the fire, and brought her here. He locked her in the dark, determined to break her spirit." Samuel felt like he couldn't breathe. The story his father had told him, the story of a tragic accident, had been a lie to cover an act of unimaginable cruelty. "I was 5 years old when she disappeared," he said, his voice hollow. "He told me the fire took her." "He didn't just want you to forget her," his mother said, her voice stronger now. "He wanted to erase her." "No," Samuel said, his jaw clenching so tight it ached. A forgotten memory surfaced, a flash of his father's face, twisted with rage. "I didn't forget. I just learned to stop believing myself." They drank the tea in a heavy silence, the only sounds the crackling fire and the howling storm outside. The house, which had felt like a trap just hours ago, now felt like a sanctuary, a fortress. But the peace was fragile, and it was the redhead who shattered it. "You're still not safe," she said, her eyes fixed on the rain-streaked windows. "None of us are." Samuel turned to her. "What do you mean?" "Sterling knows," she said, naming his father's lawyer, a man whose smile was as thin and sharp as a razor blade. "He's the one who wrote the will, the one who crafted the one-night clause. It wasn't a test for you, Samuel. It was a death sentence. He's coming at dawn." "For what?" "For everything," his mother answered. "For the land. For the secrets buried with it. And to make sure I can never speak again. He'll come with men, the kind of men your father used to keep on his payroll. He's expecting to find your body. He's expecting to find us broken." Samuel stood up, his exhaustion replaced by a cold, clear rage. "Then we don't wait for him. We meet him head on." But the scarred sister shook her head, a slow, deliberate motion. "No, we wait. We let him come to us." She pointed a long finger toward a dark shape visible through the window, barely illuminated by the flashes of lightning. "The old barn. That's where they'll go first. That's where your father kept his real treasures. His ledgers, his deeds, his sins all written down on paper. It's where he buried his secrets. And it's where we will end this." The grandfather clock in the hall began to chime, each of its 12 strokes sounding a death knell. Midnight. The night was only half over. Samuel took a deep breath and began checking the rifle he had left by the door. The women moved without a word, gathering lanterns, thick ropes, and heavy wood-cutting axes. His mother, with hands that still trembled slightly, lit a single white candle. Together they stepped out into the raging storm. The wind and rain tore at them, but they moved as one, a small, determined army. The ranch no longer felt cursed. It felt like a battleground, and judgment was finally coming. The barn doors groaned in protest as they forced them open. The air inside was thick and heavy, smelling of mold, hay, and old sorrows. It was even darker than the cellar. Following his mother's direction, they went to a specific stall in the back. Under a pile of rotted timbers, they pried up the floorboards. There, nestled in the damp earth, was a heavy, leather-wrapped box, its clasp sealed with the same black wax as the ledger in the cellar. With an axe, Samuel shattered the lock. Inside, it wasn't gold or money. It was something far more valuable and far more dangerous. Stacks of papers, photographs, and letters, all meticulously organized. It was a detailed account of his father's entire criminal empire. Letters of blackmail sent to judges and senators. Forged deeds showing how he stole land from his neighbors. A list of every man he had bribed, ruined, or made disappear. This wasn't just about a ranch. It was about controlling the entire valley, its politics, its water, its very future. The redhead sorted through the documents, her face grim. This is what Sterling is coming for. Proof that could hang him and half the men in the state capital. We burn it, Samuel said immediately. We destroy it all and walk away. No, his mother said, her voice ringing with an authority he hadn't heard in 20 years. She held up a specific ledger. We use it. A deafening crack of thunder exploded directly overhead, so powerful it shook the very foundations of the barn. And in the ringing silence that followed, they heard it. The sound of hooves squelching in the mud, the jingle of harnesses, the low, guttural muttering of men trying to stay quiet. Boots, dozens of them. They were surrounding the house. They're early, the black-clad sister whispered, her hand tightening around the handle of her axe. No, Samuel said, his eyes scanning the darkness outside. They're desperate. He looked at the 3 women who had been his captors, his judges, and now his allies. You've defended this land for 20 years. You've defended her. Let me fight for it now. Before they could argue, he stepped out of the barn and into the rain, his rifle held loosely at his side. Another flash of lightning split the sky, and in the stark, momentary light, he saw them. Sterling stood by the front gate, a smug, confident smile on his face, the rain pouring off the brim of his expensive hat. Behind him, at least a dozen men, armed with rifles and pistols, fanned out, their faces hard and ugly. "Samuel!" Sterling called out, his voice cutting through the storm. "Well, I'll be. I see you're still breathing. How disappointing." "You came early, Sterling," Samuel called back, his voice calm and steady. "I've always hated surprises," the lawyer replied, stepping forward. "Now, be a good boy, hand over the will, step aside, and let us clean up this little mess your father left behind." "The will is right here," Samuel said, holding up the soaked parchment. "And so are the sisters. They're waiting for you inside." Sterling's smile twitched. "Don't be a fool. Step aside." "No." A heavy silence fell, broken only by the drumming rain. "You really want to die for a piece of dirt and 3 freaks?" Sterling sneered. "Just like your mother almost did?" "She's alive, Sterling." The lawyer froze, his smug expression melting away. "You're lying. She's inside, and she remembers everything." At that moment, the front door of the house opened. His mother stepped out onto the porch, bathed in the warm light from the house, the white candle still flickering in her hand. She looked frail, but she stood tall. Sterling's face went white as a sheet. That's not possible," he stammered. "She kept the records, Sterling," Samuel continued, pressing his advantage. "All of them. The ones you and my father thought were burned to ash." Sterling's hand instinctively went to the pistol at his hip. "Samuel, Don't be stupid. Give me that box from the barn, and I'll let you and the old woman walk away from here. I'll even give you a horse." "You can have the box," Samuel said, a cold smile touching his lips. "But you'll have to come and take it from me yourself." As if on cue, the wind suddenly died down. The rain softened to a drizzle, and one by one, the sisters stepped out of the shadows of the barn to stand behind Samuel. First, the sister in black, her axe held ready. Then the redhead, her eyes burning like embers. And finally, the tallest sister, the scar on her throat a pale, terrifying line in the gloom. They stood like ancient monoliths, silent and immovable, the rain soaking their clothes, their combined presence a physical force that pushed back against the night. Sterling's hired guns began to shuffle nervously, their rifles suddenly feeling very heavy. They had been paid to kill a young man and scare 3 women. They hadn't signed up for this. "Shoot them!" Sterling screamed, his voice cracking with panic. "What are you waiting for? Shoot them all!" No one moved. Their eyes were wide with a primal fear, the kind of fear that legends are made of. "They're just women! They're witches!" Sterling shrieked, his composure completely gone. Still, his men hesitated, taking shuffling steps backward. Then, the redhead spoke, her voice carrying effortlessly over the storm. "Tell them, Sterling. Tell them what you and his father did to our mother when we were just children. Tell them how you helped him bury the bodies of the men who crossed him in the apple orchard. Tell them you're not here for a piece of land. You're here to erase the only living witnesses to your crimes." Sterling's face crumpled. A pathetic whimpering sound escaped his lips. And then he did the one thing no one expected. He turned and ran. He scrambled through the mud, slipping and falling, clawing his way back to his horse like a terrified animal, leaving his men and his reputation behind in the dirt. One by one, his hired guns lowered their rifles and simply melted back into the darkness, wanting no part of the judgment that was unfolding at the Harper Ranch. The sisters didn't give chase. They didn't have to. Samuel walked forward, his rifle now slung over his shoulder, and bent down. He picked up the soaked, muddy Will from the ground. As the first rays of dawn began to break through the storm clouds, painting the eastern sky a bruised purple and blood red, the ranch was finally quiet, and it was finally his. His mother stood on the porch, the candle now extinguished, a small, weary smile on her face. The sisters stood beside him, watching the sun rise. The land was his. But for the first time in his life, he felt he had earned more than just land. He had earned their trust. He wasn't inheriting a curse. He was standing on the foundations of something new, something worth protecting. The next morning brought a silence that was different. It wasn't the heavy, watchful silence of before. It was a calm, clean silence, the kind that comes after a fever breaks. Samuel sat on the top step of the porch, a rifle resting across his lap, his boots still caked with the mud of the previous night's war. The sky was a soft, forgiving gray. Inside, he could hear the low murmur of his mother's voice, a sound he had only ever heard in dreams. The sisters moved through the house with a quiet efficiency, sweeping away the mud, mending a window shattered by the wind, erasing the last physical traces of Sterling's intrusion. No blood had been spilled, not on their land, but it still felt as though a great battle had been won. He couldn't stop replaying the final moments. Sterling's face contorted in a mask of pure terror as his lies crumbled around him. The way his hired thugs had dissolved into the night, spooked not by violence, but by the sheer, unshakable power of the truth. He replayed the image of the 3 sisters standing behind him, not as monsters, but as pillars. He had expected to feel ownership or maybe triumph. Instead, he just felt lighter, as if a weight he didn't even know he was carrying had been lifted from his soul. One by one, they joined him on the porch. The redhead, whose name he now knew was Clara, handed him a piece of warm bread wrapped in a clean cloth. "You didn't sleep," she stated. It wasn't a question. Didn't want to, he admitted, taking the bread. Was afraid I'd wake up and this would all have been a dream. Ruth, the sister who always wore black, sat on the steps below him, her sharp features softened in the morning light. You have your mother's eyes, she said, her voice softer than he'd ever heard it. He nodded, a lump forming in his throat. I don't remember her voice, not really, but I remember the way she smelled, like cinnamon and rain. I used to think I'd made it up. She kept a journal, said Miriam, the tall, scarred sister. She leaned against the porch railing, her gaze fixed on the distant hills. All those years in the dark, she wrote, you should read it. He looked up at her, at the scar that had once seemed so terrifying, and now just looked like a mark of survival. Why are you helping me, after everything my family did? Because last night, Miriam said, finally meeting his gaze, you didn't fight like your father. He fought for power. You fought for a person. You didn't come here to take. You came here to find. Samuel looked out across the sprawling ranch. The sun was finally piercing the clouds, its rays spilling across the fields, making the wet grass glitter. I don't want the land, he said, the words surprising him as they came out. Not his way, not with his name attached to it. Then reshape it, Clara said, a faint smile on her lips. Wash his name off it, make it yours, make it hers. He nodded slowly, and in that quiet moment, with the smell of rain and clean earth in the air, the land truly became his. Not by law, not by inheritance, but by choice. Later that day, they took him back down into the earth, but not to the prison cell. Miriam led him to the root cellar, its shelves lined with jars of preserved fruits and vegetables. She pushed aside a heavy rack of canned peaches, revealing a section of the stone floor that looked different. Together, they lifted a heavy stone slab, uncovering a small, hidden compartment. Inside was another box. This one was smaller, made of simple, light-colored wood, with the initials M.W. delicately carved into the lid. Margaret Walsh, his mother's name, his mother's box. He lifted it out. It was light. Inside, there were no ledgers of sin, no deeds of stolen land. There were only letters, dozens of them, tied in neat bundles with twine, pages and pages of elegant looping handwriting. Some were addressed to him, some to the sisters, many were addressed to no one at all, just thoughts spilled onto paper in the lonely dark. One thick bundle, tied with a faded blue ribbon, had his name on it. Samuel. He didn't open it right away. He took it up to the hayloft in the barn, the place where he had decided to fight, and sat with it as evening fell. The air smelled of old rope and dry wheat. With trembling fingers, he finally pulled the ribbon loose. My dearest Samuel, the first letter began. If you are reading this, it means you survived the night. And if the sisters gave this to you, it means you have a heart worth saving. That is all I ever prayed for. Not revenge, not justice, not this land. Just for you to live, and to live free of his shadow. He read on, the words blurring through his tears. She wrote of the crushing loneliness, the years of silence, the pain that became her constant companion. But she didn't write with bitterness. She wrote of hope. She wrote of the 3 strange, silent girls who found her, who risked their own lives to keep her alive. They brought her food and water, mended her clothes, read to her from books they smuggled from town when her own eyes grew too weak to see in the gloom. They had built gardens of herbs and wildflowers on the earth directly above her prison, a quiet act of defiance, refusing to let his hate poison the very soil. She told him the truth he had only glimpsed. His father hadn't just wanted the ranch. He wanted to crush anything, and anyone, that he could not control. He despised women who said no. He hated anything that made him feel small, and the sisters, with their towering height, their fierce independence, and their unshakable bond were everything his father feared. They were wild and unashamed, so he tried to break them, first with scorn, then with violence. And when that failed, he twisted their story, turning their strength into a monstrous legend to keep the rest of the world away. "They are not a curse, Samuel," his mother wrote on the final page. "They are a blessing. They are what this world is so terrified of, women who survive." He carefully folded the letters, pressing them to his chest. He could feel the weight of his mother's words, the years of her silent endurance. That night, under the quiet watch of the stars, he knew what he had to do. The following week, riders came to the ranch again. But this time, they weren't armed thugs. They were reporters, sheriffs, and curious townsfolk. The news of Sterling's panicked flight had spread like wildfire. The lawyer himself had vanished, swallowed up by the night. Rumors swirled through the valley, the old, fearful whispers about the sisters mixing with new, confused tales of what had happened. Samuel stood on the porch, his mother sitting in a rocking chair beside him, the sisters standing behind them, a united front. A local preacher, a man with a pinched face and judgmental eyes, cleared his throat. "Mr. Harper," he began, "now that this unpleasantness is behind us, I assume you'll be selling this property?" "No," Samuel said, his voice clear and strong. "I'm reopening the school." The preacher blinked. "A school?" "For women," Samuel continued, his gaze sweeping over the crowd. "For girls. For anyone this town has cast out because they were too different, too tall, too loud, or too poor to fit in. This will be a place for them." The preacher scoffed. "And the ranch? What about the ranching?" A real smile touched Samuel's lips. "This land fed my father's pride for too long. It's time it fed something better." And it did. The barn, once a place of secrets and fear, was cleaned out and became a classroom and a gathering hall. The fields, once used for grazing cattle destined for market, were tilled and planted with vegetables to feed anyone who was hungry. The doors of the main house were never locked again. Anyone with a story to tell or a wound to heal was welcomed inside. The sisters were no longer guardians of a prison. They became the heart of a community. Samuel never became the man his father was. He became the man his mother had always hoped he could be. And when newcomers to the valley would ask about the old legend, about the 3 giant women who haunted the cursed ranch on the hill, Samuel wouldn't correct them. He'd just smile. Because some legends are meant to scare people into submission. But the truth, if you're brave enough to seek it, can set an entire town free. And Samuel Harper, standing on the porch of the home he had reclaimed, had finally found his. Summer settled over the valley like it had never left. The fields that had been cracked and barren now swayed with green life. The sound of children's laughter now echoed in the yard, where only the wind used to scream. In the main house, Margaret Walsh, no longer a prisoner of the dark, sat at the head of the long oak table, a new ledger open before her. This one didn't track debts of sin, it tracked donations. $1 from a widow in the next town. A bag of seeds from a farmer who had once feared this land. A letter of support from a woman 100 miles away who had read their story in a newspaper. Each entry was a small miracle. Samuel stood at the edge of the property, a hammer in his hand, a new sign resting against the fence posts. It didn't say Harper Ranch. It said, Walsh Sanctuary. All are welcome. It wasn't a ranch anymore. It was a refuge. The town still watched, some with suspicion, some with resentment, but most watched with a quiet shame, because the truth, once it's out, has a way of lingering in the air, making people re-examine their own silence. The sisters finally had their names back. People started using them. Clara, the fiery redhead, taught self-defense and mechanics in the barn, her laughter booming as she showed young girls how to change a wagon wheel and how to throw a punch. Miriam, the tall sister with the scar, ran a small clinic on the back porch. using the herbs from their garden to stitch wounds and soothe fevers for those the town doctor wouldn't see. And Ruth, the quiet one in black, taught reading and writing to children and adults alike under the shade of the old oak tree. She rarely smiled, but when a student finally managed to read a full sentence on their own, a light would come into her dark eyes, a fierce, protective pride. Samuel didn't lead them. He worked alongside them. He learned to listen more than he spoke. He fixed fences, dug wells, and drove the wagon into town for supplies, meeting the stares of the townsfolk with a steady, unapologetic gaze. At night, he would sit with his mother by the fire. Sometimes they talked for hours, filling in the 20 lost years. Sometimes they sat in a comfortable silence, the simple fact of being in the same room together enough. And sometimes she would cry, a sudden memory of the cellar rising up to haunt her, and he would hold her hand until it passed. The papers in the city had called it a reckoning. The town called it a scandal. But for the people living at the Walsh Sanctuary, it was simply a beginning. One hot afternoon, a dusty wagon rattled up the road. Samuel recognized the boy driving it, Jesse Finch, a quiet, haunted-looking 16-year-old from a family known for its troubles. In the back of the wagon sat his younger sister, maybe 12 years old, a dark bruise purpling her cheek, her hands clutching the wooden seat so hard her knuckles were white. Samuel didn't ask a single question. He just swung the gate wide open. Margaret met the girl at the steps, her arms open, her voice as soft as a prayer. "You're safe now, child. You're safe here." And just like that, another life was saved. Another soul found sanctuary. That night, after the house had settled into a peaceful sleep, Samuel walked out to the apple orchard. He stood for a long time among the trees, thinking of the 27 graves on the hill. He had never dug them up. Instead, he had placed a single, unmarked wooden cross on each one. They may have come with malice in their hearts, but they were still pawns in his father's vicious game, and he refused to let them be forgotten. The wind rustled the leaves, carrying the sweet scent of the coming harvest. The porch light flickered on behind him. Clara was standing there, her arms crossed over her chest. "You coming in soon?" she asked. He nodded. "In a minute." She hesitated, then said, "You know, we were wrong about you, Samuel." He turned and gave her a small, tired smile. "It's all right. I was wrong about me, too." She left the door open for him. Back in his room, he opened his mother's journal to the very last page. In the corner, in faded ink, she had written a final instruction. "When the land is finally safe for everyone, plant something that will outlive us all." So, the next morning, he did. He started digging a hole in the front yard, not far from the porch. His hands were soon raw, but he didn't stop. Before long, Miriam joined him, taking a turn with the shovel. Then Ruth and Clara. His mother came out, bringing them cool water. Jesse and his sister came to help, their movements shy at first, then more confident. The children from the reading circle, the women from the clinic, they all came. Together, under the warm morning sun, they planted a young oak tree. Not for his father's memory, and not for the claim to the land. They planted it for the future. As they packed the dark, rich soil around its fragile roots, Samuel looked at the faces around him, the bruised, the forgotten, the brave, the resilient, and he finally understood. The ranch didn't belong to him. It belonged to them. It belonged to anyone who had ever survived a long night in the dark and dared to walk out into the dawn. If this story moved you, if it made you feel something deep down in your bones, then don't just scroll away. Hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell, because stories like this are more than just entertainment. They are a reminder that even in the darkest of places, hope can take root. They remind us that we all have the strength to face the monsters in our lives, whether they live under the floorboards or inside our own families. Someone out there right now is surviving their own long night. And by sharing these stories, we can be the light that helps them find their way to the morning. Thank you for watching.